I want to thank everyone for coming, and we're gonna talk about how to sample forages for nitrogen, for nitrates analysis. So you want to collect a good sample, and we're going to go out and we'll sample this bale when we're done outside. But the objective is to get a good sample and tons per pounds per grams per parts per million. Sampling air, taking the sample, handling the sample prior to analysis. So accuracy versus precision. So this talks about how to sample a bale. So here's your bale, low accuracy and low precision. So you see how it's all over the board right here. Low accuracy, high precision, and high accuracy, low precision. When you sample a hay bale, you want everything taken right out of the middle. Forage lot consists of forage taking from one field at the sand cutting maturity within 48 hours. Usually contains fewer than 100 tons of hay. Forage lot of sample for forage type. A lot of things go into that: maturity, cutting date, variety of feed, weed infestation, type of harvest equipment, weather during growth, harvest and stage of conditions. So like right here, this is a feed field. This is the first cutting of feed. So they split it in two. So they took the field, just split it right down the middle. This side's pure feed. This side has grass. It's infested with grass. The second cutting of feed, they split it into thirds. So same here, grass infested, and then pure with rain damage here, pure with no rain damage. So you're going to get your feed, with your better feed will come with no rain. Sampling bales, group of bales, feed source, forage quality, risk management. You're checking for nitrates. Sort bales. Just go out. Don't just pick random bales. Don't pick the same bales. Just go out in your field. Just pick random bales, or if you have them stacked. It can be identified and maintained during feeding. So, and here, like I said, we're going to go out and I'll show you how to sample a bale. But here's an old style of a bale tester, a core sampler. Sampling bales, sample as close to the feeding as possible. Rule of thumb, sample 10 to 20% of the bales in the lot. And like I said, randomly go out and select. Use an appropriate sampling device. There's many options available. Ensure consistent stem and leaf ratio. Weather and damage of large round bales. Most of the damage on a feed bale is the outer edge of the feed bale, the 10 inches. 50% of the hay in a bale with a ratio of 30 inches and the outer 9 inches of the bale. Proper core sampling procedures must be adjusted to consider this change. See, like this guy right here, he's sampling the top of the bale. So like I was saying, here's your round bale. The outer 4 inches, 25% of the bale. The outer 6 inches, 30% of the bale. The outer 18, 75%. You want to take your sample right in here. We see a lot more round bales than we do square bales, but I wanted to throw square bales in. So it's the same, stem leaf ratio. taken from the ends. Sample ends with the probe at 90 degrees. Drill style works well. And that's what we have. We have the drill style. Safety, bells fall, it happens. Now we're gonna go talk about standing forages like milo, feed. So we got some milo right here. Crop residue, like I said, representative sample of forage, not easy, difficult to determine what livestock will eat. So going out, your your nitrates is at the lower end of your stock. So the whole plant samples, so get a pair of cutters, go out and cut. Pulling plants equals soil contamination. Clip at the same height, marker clippers so you know where you cut at. Standing forages, like I said, protocols. Walk one plant for 50 to 100 steps, 4 corners to the center. Chop the whole plant into 1 to 3 pieces and place in clean bucket. Mix subsoil or subsample in gallon bag. Final thoughts. Forage analysis is often overlooked as a management tool. Feedstuff can be potentially huge. Poor sampling techniques or protocols can be created more problems than producers might think. We'll run outside and I'll show you guys how to correctly core sample a bale.
Oh, yes and no.
I was nervous up there. I kind of ran through.
Since you're wanting to do this, I can't have anybody without a mask except you.
What?
So I can't have anybody without a mask except,
So I need to put a mask on?
no, you don't have to. And we'll have to-
Anybody else?
we need to edit this too.
Okay. So like I said, you want to get a sample right in the middle. Okay. Yeah. Surprisingly.
When's the moisture too high when the bale starts burning? I mean, what do you put it up at? 12 moisture or something? I can't remember.
Yeah, if it goes up, it's too high for you.
Sorry, is that something you said?
So you get your bag, and these are from Servitech. Always remember to write on your bag before you put your sample in, because it's a lot harder when your sample's in there. And like this one is a Colorado hay style probe. I didn't get much, but at least everybody kind of sees. And just dump your sample in there. But you didn't get much. Exactly. So
So how much would you have to send in? A handful?
Like
Good
half
handle.
to,
Good handle.
half to
half to-
three-fourths
yep.
full is what they prefer.
3/4 full?
Yeah. Well, they want a representative
Yeah.
sample. If you send too much, why did you just go into one bale 2 inches and call that your sample? Well, that's no more.
I remember we're taking Dad's genetic test and he's supposed to spit, you know, and he didn't ever send it in, so that's not enough spit.
Oh, not enough spit.
So you gotta have enough to make it work.
The other thing to keep in mind is you got something pretty homogeneous like prairie hay or something. You really don't need as much of a sample if you got something, say you got some baled forage sorghum that's got grain in it, you know, or something that's got a grain forage mix. You're gonna want a bigger sample than something that's more uniform.
I always probe them from the side, never from the end, because the end, if you probe in the middle, you're getting what went into that bale first. That's all you're getting. You're not getting the rest of it. Where if you probe through the netting,
You're getting a more
why
representative.
then you're probing through, and as that bale makes, if you run down the field, you're getting every, well, let's see, 6 times 3 is 18 feet. Every 18 feet, you're getting another sample of what you're doing. Plus, it's easier to probe. Well, it's not as easy to probe as the end, but if you use an electric drill, it sure makes it a lot easier. I used to use the hand cranks. I don't know how many have used a hand crank before, but boy, now those will work you to death.
Yeah.
There you go. That's what we're
Awesome.
talking. We're gonna go to school, teachers right.
Exactly. All right, is there any questions? I know I kind of ran through that really quick. I was.
So when's the moisture too high? You know, baling, we used to bail a long time ago with, I'm not here for that, I'm from Milo anyway. Just asking the question. 12 moisture, that just right?
I think it depends a lot on was the hay absolutely dry before you got the dew on it that night and you started baling? That makes a world of difference. I've baled at 35 moisture and I've baled at 11 and 12 moisture, and they keep fine. And the reason for that is the hay was absolutely dry and all we got was the toughness to make a decent bale. And so you can bale it a lot wetter, but now if you're catching as the moisture is drying down in the stalk and stuff, if it's
Then
feed
you
or
could have a
something,
spontaneous combustion. Yeah, burn it
real
up.
easy.
Yeah, okay.
just because, then you'd probably want to get down into that 12 moisture versus 18 or 20, because you might have spots in there that are 45 and 50% moisture, and those will burn.
I've seen stuff burn up.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody has it to put them up.
Yeah.
Everybody crosses
Let's
that
put
line.
this over here, put this over here. Yeah.
I've never burned any up, so I'm sure I haven't burned one.
Can you edit them?
Yes.
Well, since it's going on the internet.
No, it's not. Going to it's going to cloud.
Okay.
You got to store it. You'll have to, I know. Do it to the computer. No. I'm just saying. Just because.
All this, typically by now, from my little socks, float all these out of it. All you got is the socks sticking there. Well, I've got a lot of where we cut high use off of them, and cut high. It still can. Now you just get chemical. Put it down the ground. And do something with those socks. Knock them down. Something like that. Well, I mean, walls, back.
Good question. Where we were getting moisture, and where we did, I mean, there's places. Yeah. Never had. And then places that didn't run off the auger. You know, you wouldn't drill this, they mess up their. Or they didn't run out of the auger. And it was kind of, well, where there's a lot of residue and stuff, we do. The weather is open. It's dry. It's dry. Well, with this all part. Yeah, just to kind of smooth it up. Plus, I was trying to learn how to use GPS. Or the new GPS, we upgraded all of our GPS systems. Not the same. Well, and I couldn't figure out why the damn thing was locked off the line. Oh, yeah. Well, I was screwed to bring it around, and I had my hand on the steering wheel. Well, it's a sensitive. That you have your hand on it like that, it's on and it's back off. And after I figured out that that's what I'd done wrong, so then I tried to let go and just go around so far and let go of the steering, then hit the button. So I called out our new guy, I didn't push on the line, and it's gonna do it right now. You're 10 feet off, you can cut 3 forward, you're on that. I'll take it. Where my old 500. And I did, and I was spraying like, you get around there, walk on the line. Yeah, maybe 100 feet down the road, like, and it, you know, so where it needs to be, it's so you need the street, and you have to go back. Make it mad. Yes, boy, the different man. Killed 13. They were in a SUV, 125. Stack that way. So when that semi killed half of them. All right, we're gonna get back started. I want to introduce Sarah Lancaster. She's the assistant professor and extension specialist. Thank you, Sarah, for coming.
Oh, you are welcome. It's a pleasure to be here, and y'all, it is good to be out of Manhattan. Not that it's not a lovely place, but it sure is nice to see real humans and share space. So Kyle asked me to talk about grain sorghum today, so we'll talk grain sorghum weed control and get going. So you guys are I'm sure, aware of these things. Some of our key weed species here that we need to think about in grain sorghum. Everybody's favorite, that guy right there, Palmer amaranth, right? If I had to guess, I would say that's probably the #1 thing that gets you guys as we start thinking about post-emergence applications in grain sorghum. Some others, another one, super important would be the sorghum species. So shadow cane, Johnson grass, right? Other grasses, crabgrass, maybe foxtails. And then morning glory comes up on a lot of surveys as well as being problematic in grain sorghum. And one of the things that I'm seeing in my plots in Manhattan is that we are focusing, I think, so much on this guy that we're starting to miss some of those weeds that were problematic 10, 20 years ago. And we're going to start, I'm afraid, having to pay a little bit more attention to them just because we've taken our eye off of them. All right. This is what happens when cutting close on time, gentlemen. So I was just gonna ask you guys, what are your top weed problems? That was what that slide was supposed to be. And we're a small enough crowd, I think we're all friends. I don't know. I hope. So Palmer, what else?
Shattercane.
Shattercane, Johnson grass. Is there anything that I missed on my other slide?
We're starting to have problems with windmill grass, even though it's not one that you're gonna see stick up above the lateral.
Yeah,
Because it lays so close to the ground.
I hear windmill grass almost every time I talk to a crowd west of Solana. I would say that's probably fair. The unfortunate thing is that I'm not sure we have any awesome answers for you guys at this point in terms of windmill grass. We're working, we're gonna work on it, okay? Anything else?
Kochia is another,
Kochia,
has always been a big problem, although 2,4-D and Banville still works at time. If you catch it right, it works well. But if you mess up with it, Roundup doesn't seem to touch
Yeah.
too much.
so Kochia, I know, again, once we get out west, Kochia becomes a bigger problem. I think Vipin is doing some work looking at Kochia control and sorghum at the Hayes Research Station. So we should start to pull some data that will be helpful for you guys in that regard. Anything else we need to pay attention to?
The time to maximize your kosher control is now.
That's right.
Years ago.
Yeah, so I posted a picture from Southwest Kansas. It was a scout on social media. They're already finding kochia coming up. So the best time to control kochia is before it comes up. That's the truth for most weeds. I would tell you the same thing about Palmer. The best time to control it is before you see it. And so that's a great transition. As we think about thinking about grain sorghum weed management, thinking about the fact that we don't have a lot of super awesome herbicide options in grain sorghum, right? It's a little smaller acreage crop. The companies don't put as much effort into discovering new chemistry for grain sorghum. So things like integrated management practices are super important for grain sorghum production. One of the big ones, you guys talked about Johnson grass and Shattercane, right? Crop rotation. Great way to take care of some things like that. And then timely applications. So Lucas talked about the importance of those pre-emergent applications for kochia control. And I'll tell you the same, I told you I'd say the same thing about Palmer as far as those pre-emergent applications. But as we think about post-emergent applications, there's a reason that the companies put those height restrictions or those height recommendations on the labels, right? It is unrealistic of us to think that we should expect these herbicides to take down waist-high Palmer amaranth when the label clearly says 4 inches, okay? We just gotta manage our expectations and be timely. And I don't want that to come across like I'm preaching at you guys, because I get it. Y'all are juggling a lot of stuff. Weather doesn't always work in our favor. I get it, but that's just a reminder, okay? Something else that has been on my mind a lot this spring is the potential for carryover. So I put this slide in this set, thinking about the fact that we're probably going to have expanded sorghum acres this year, just looking at the commodity markets, and everybody's kind of predicting a dry summer, right? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to put 2 and 2 together and figure out that we're probably going to see more sorghum acres this summer. So these data actually are from more central Kansas, but I have created graphs like this for a few of the weather stations. So this blue, and they're pretty consistent, okay? So this blue line is how much rain we should expect to accumulate. So I started pulling data in July. So thinking about when herbicide applications would have been last made for the 2020 season. And then I pulled these data at the beginning of February. So they're about a month old now. But blue line is how much we should have expected to accumulate in that time period. Green line down here are the daily rainfall events. And the red line that kind of stair steps is how much precipitation we've actually had. So this gap right here is telling me that the bacteria, the fungi that live in the soil and that are the primary that facilitate the primary processes that are responsible for breaking down herbicides, those microorganisms need water. If they don't have water, they're not working on those herbicide molecules, so we're more likely to have carryover. So I just pulled together a list here of some of the corn and soybean products that might be likely to have carried over or to carry over. So if you think about your corn program last year, things like Accent, Python, Borrow, if those were in your program, you might want to think carefully about carryover. And then some soybean products, Classic, First Rate, Pursuit, those ALS inhibiting herbicides, Raptor, Scepter, and then Reflex can actually have some carryover to sorghum as well. So some of those are pretty common soybean herbicides. I know there's some beans here in this area. So if you think about switching to grain sorghum instead of corn, we might need to think about some of those carryover implications. So we've talked about carryover. We've talked about crop rotation. Let's think about the importance of starting. So again, we've said a couple times, before you ever see the weeds, it's the best time to control them, especially in crops like grain sorghum. If you get behind, how much fun is it to play catch up when you get behind? You're laughing.
Pretty hard.
Pretty hard, right? So thinking about conventional tillage, really paying attention to burn down herbicides. And guys, I just want to take a minute and say burn down products don't have to be fancy and they shouldn't be expensive. So what we're trying to do with these burn down applications is make sure that our trees that we put down at planting have the best chance to work as well as possible for as long as possible. So if you've got a mess of winter annual something out there that's keeping your trees from getting to the soil, that's not good, right? So really our burn downs are just trying to wipe that slate clean. They don't need to be expensive. And the other question that I get a lot while we're talking about burn down, it's not a bad plan, especially if you think about, super early applications to have some residual herbicide in there, kochia, right? We want some residual activity in there when we're talking about kochia. But that residual that you put in your burn down cannot 100% replace the residual active. The herbicides just don't stick around that long. Okay.
Is the rule of thumb still 60 to 90 days? 60 days is typically all that you should expect.
Yeah,
control.
that's probably.
And then hopefully the plant's big enough to outrun it,
So,
outrun whatever might come up.
so yeah, 8 weeks, not a bad expectation. Weather plays a role in that, right? You've got a lot of rainfall, you're losing herbicide at the bottom of your soil profile, greater microbial activity. So watching that. And the other thing that has been on my mind a lot when I've been talking to soybean and corn farmers is just this idea of how much control is enough. So I was driving back yesterday from Wichita to Manhattan, and it was a pretty day, right? Like I was loving life, doing a little windshield scouting, pulled over and just walked out into a wheat field that had been planted into corn stalks. Okay, so it was corn in 2020. They sowed wheat, and like 20 steps into the field, I see a Palmer amaranth in flower, like huge, right? You get down in there and you look at the ground and you can just see where the seeds have all fallen out and now they're laying on the ground. So let's assume that farmer had 95% control of the Palmer amaranth in that field, but he still had a couple of plants an acre doing that. Is that really enough when you think about what we need to do and what it takes to kill Palmer? You're laughing, okay. There's a lot of seeds on one of those. And so, again, you don't want to play catch up with Palmer. One of the things that we need to think about when we're managing kochia, Palmer, these plants that have a lot of herbicide resistance and they produce a lot of seeds, usually those two traits go together, is that we have to manage the season. Right? It's sort of like cutting off the supply chain of the opposing army, right? When we target the seed bank, we're taking those potential weeds that we have to control for next year out. So I don't know where I started down that story. I hope it was hope it was worthwhile, but let's get back here. So questions I get asked, what do you recommend for freeze? You know the standard here, guys. Y'all probably know this, some of y'all know this as well as I do. Something with atrazine, a group 27 product, so one of those bleachers, Callisto, that's gonna benefit from the atrazine, right? There's a little bit of synergy in there. And then a group 15 product, something like a dual or an acetylchlor. Okay, that is kind of the standard rec. The feedback that I'm getting from folks who actually do these things in the field is that that's a pretty common application. And these are just a couple of data points to demonstrate, you know, those products work well. Okay, those are from some plots in Manhattan. Things to think about. Another question that I get a lot. So we had a question already exported about how much time to expect out of these residuals. A kind of corresponding question is, when do I use which one? So especially when we think about these group 15 products, the duals, the harnesses, the outlooks, they require rainfall for activation. And so just being aware of some of the differences between the amounts of rainfall required for activation can be important. Now, I'm not telling you that you're gonna see, you know, if you get a 1/4 inch of rainfall and you use harness, that you're gonna see a 40% increase in weed management if you use dual instead. But you're gonna see some benefit there probably in that regard. Now, I will also tell you that my bear rep is straight up said, it takes at least a 1/2 inch to activate acetylchlor. So something to think about there. The other thing to think about, especially with like acetylchlor, is if you're using an encapsulated formulation, you're probably going to need a little bit more rainfall for activation there than other formulations. So Outlook doesn't give any recommendations. It just says rainfall or irrigation. But there are some differences in there. And so again, this is one of the reasons why these combinations work, right? You have some that get activated quickly, some that take a little bit longer, a little bit more precipitation to activate. And that's a concept to keep in mind with kochia too, right? That's why one of those kind of standard recs is to have that humic in there. It doesn't take a lot of rainfall to activate. And then if you want to put another residual in there that lasts a little longer, it takes a little more to activate. That's a good thing. All right, so let's think now about staying with it. All right. So you guys know as well as I do, not a ton of options. I put this list together based on activity on Palmer. Okay, so all of those would be things that are listed in the weed guide as having good activity on Palmer amaranth. So some things I want to point out here, paying attention to application timing relative to the grain sorghum. Okay, got to stay on top of that. You guys know that. And then the other thing, we've already made reference to this morning, is staying on top of timing in terms of your weed height. Okay, so those are straight off of the labels. My favorite one on that list, of course, is 240 saying small. That's fantastic and helpful, isn't it? But others, so Husky has a 4-inch limit, and then atrazine has a 1.5 inch limit. So just things to think about. We got to get out there. Boots on the ground, right? If you can see the Palmer doing the windshield scouting exercise, you probably missed your application timing, right? I'm a fan of windshield scouting, nothing wrong with it, but it can't be the only big thing you're doing. Other things to think about here, extending application time with drop nozzles if you have that, access to that, and then just a reminder about using some of those group 15 herbicides in your post application. Let's say we're a little behind on growth. Okay, let's say we don't think that crop is really going to be competitive 8 weeks after planting. Gosh, I don't want us to be in that situation, but just hypothetically speaking, for whatever reason, you haven't had the growth that you thought you were going to have, and you're afraid that your residual that you put down is going to run out. Those group 15 products, they've got a label for over the top. Not a bad thing, yes.
So we put the herbicide on, how long is it gonna sit there before it's activated?
So the good news is that it's probably going to stick around a fair amount of time. These products generally have low volatility. They're not susceptible to degradation by sunlight. So it's not like, when you think about things like yellow herbicides, right? Prowl or shrubland, you don't get a rain, you don't get those incorporated. You're probably going to lose them between those two processes. These Group 15 products are not as susceptible to those two degradation pathways. Now I'm dancing, right? I'm not telling you 2 weeks or 10 days. That I'm just as bad as you.
So is there a point to rotary hoe or something?
Yeah, you could do that
I don't want.
if you're in a tillage system. Who wants to make another pass across the field, right? Nobody does. I'm dancing, so that data, I haven't seen that data. I don't think anybody that data. Thanks for the answer.
So with the moisture, this the humidity in the morning, you get that.
The thing is, it's got to be enough to drive that herbicide down to the how to get it into the ground. Because these herbicides, they are taken up by the weeds as the seeds turn. So it has to be down where it's not at.
What's the difference or any real quickly, because they've done it, supposedly have done away with it, but there's a lot of it out there. The difference between S-metolachlor and metolachlor.
Okay,
And they
that's a great
still have
question.
the same name. And so a lot of people think of them as the same product, but there's a lot of difference from one to the other.
Yeah, there is difference in control because basically, if you think about the chemical manufacturing process, all right, let's take a step back and answer this question. I've got 2 kids, Levi is 8, Caleb is 6. Lego fanatics, like, don't take your shoes off when you go to the playroom because you'll regret it. There's Legos everywhere, right? So I could give each of those 2 kids, I could give each of those 2 kids the same set of blocks, right? What is the likelihood that they're going to come out with the same creation? Pretty small, right? So somewhat similarly, when we are doing all of this chemistry to make these molecules, the cooking process, you can put the same ingredients in and get 2 different outcomes. That's what the S is. The S is the outcome that actually affects the plants. So if you don't have that purified form, the S-metolachlor, you've got a bunch of metolachlor in there that doesn't interact with the binding side of the plant like it's supposed to. Okay, so that's why S-metolachlor is more effective, because it's got a higher concentration. It's all that active. So some of the generics are still just straight metolachlor. So that's important to pay attention
Some
to.
people promote, some of them are promoting that they can, we can sell it to you for half the cost.
But are they going to cut your application costs in half? Are they going to cut the cost of your subsequent post packs in half? It's just something to think about. They're out there. If they work for your price point, if you're satisfied with them. But the reality is that you're getting this product. And even though they can sell it to you for half the price, are they going to also cut in half everything else that you have to do after that? So things to think about. This question was going to be, what are you guys doing for your pre-products, for your herbicide program in general? I'm curious. I've been in Kansas about 15 months. 75% of that was spent in lockdown. Thank you, Corona and K-State. So I'm still learning. I'm learning things now that I should have been out here boots on the ground.
Yes, to answer your question is put Banville in because you got to clean up some of you probably have your winter annuals that are still out there. So you use that. I use Callisto. I put it in there.
Now, are you using Callisto or are you using
I
a generic?
found, huh?
Are you using Callisto or a generic?
Most of the time I'm using generic anymore. At first I used straight Callisto. And it also, I've found, works very well long-term on bindweed.
Bindweed, okay.
And we, north of town, if you say you don't have bindweed, you're lying. Because everybody's got, type of thing.
Yeah, I heard somebody
Roundup
mention.
is another one that goes in. Some people put 2,4-D as well as the Manville. Kind of gets, one heats the other up.
Widen that spectrum a little bit.
Usually put some atrazine on this first go around. And then that, of course, that gives us some residual, as well as the blister will give us some residual to keep everything dead. So that if you plant and you don't, if you're no-tilling and you don't get a rain, you've got some residual that's hopefully already activated, that's helping you to control until the other gets activated.
Yeah, good
So
to
if
hear.
he's got harder soil, I've got sand,
Oh,
so.
It'll make a lot of difference.
yes, it will. Now you got my attention.
If he got away with it, and I got burnt.
When the weed says,
Yeah. He got $7 mile, I didn't get it. Told that, listen, you really gotta watch it.
So,
what did you say?
You gotta avoid Callisto on your sand, so
Okay, well, I'm up in hard ground.
so sand basically makes everything more available to the plants, right? There's nothing in there, no place, left you a place for organic matter, less organic matter to find those herbicides. So yeah, that makes everything more available. Good. Any other thoughts? Anything else?
Could still make high brand. And the high brand herbicide. Versus that.
What's the
You
ad?
were poor.
No, I wasn't, you're right.
Time for her, time for that.
Mono Pro.
Oh, yeah, you can still get Milo Pro.
I think that, yeah.
Yeah, you can still get that. And I mean, the caution there, right, is carry over to corn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I've thought of on herbicides, especially where I've never irrigated and I don't plant corn or I don't plant, well, main thing that I'm looking at is soybeans. I don't plant soybeans. So as that ground's laying item is to put a soybean herbicide on, because odds are we shouldn't have any resistance because it's never had soybean. Now, I don't know if that's a good thought or not,
So,
but
if-
hopefully maybe they would be cheap.
So what'd you put on?
I haven't figured out really what to put on, but I mean, that's my thought pattern. I just haven't researched it enough to try to figure out which ones, and then to try to get it in that window of from the time you plant it till the time you can plant it. You know, whatever the next crop that you're planning on planting. It's like Callisto, you've got to wait, what does it say, 11 months on Callisto, I think it is. Yeah, we put it on, or I put it on my corn ground the 1st of April. And in September, we're planting wheat in it, or as soon as we pull the corn off, we're planting wheat in it.
and so, you know, there's a lot of times you can
So
get
that's
away
solid.
with trimming that interval, but if the conditions aren't right for germination, that might affect the day.
And
But what you're
Sandy's
saying,
problem totally different.
what you're saying about going to different chemistries in your fallow period is spot on. Just don't forget about multiple modes of action, right? Those are the two things. Pound on is rotating applications with multiple modes of action. But keep your enemy guessing. So that's what we're trying to do. Just a few slides here. How are we on time? It's 10:45 now. I've been going about probably 25 minutes. Are you good with this? Rolling. All right. Just a few comments on the new grain sorghum. So this winter, last summer, iGrowth was making big splashes. They got all of their regulatory approvals. They're ready to launch. So iGrowth is, they are grain sorghum varieties that are resistant to a herbicide that's going to be marketed as Aniplex. You guys have used that before, maybe in alfalfa or soybeans as Raptor or beyond. Okay. Same class of chemistry as things like Pursue. Okay. So these guys are out here. They had limited CC available. So I have no idea what that looks like right now as far as what's still available.
It's pretty much full supply.
Is it?
Limited variety, but full supply.
Okay, thank you. Ensign. So at the Commodity Classic, Corteva did a launch for Ensign. Okay, Ensign technology's been around for a long time, but they kind of had their hand forced, right? They need to go get in or go home, go big or go home. So they're in. So Ensign, the herbicide used there is Zest, that's nicosulfuron. You guys can use that as accent in corn. So as far as activity on weeds, you can expect, similar effectiveness there. So they are going to have some varieties available this year. The one that is farthest from being commercially available is a technology called Double Team. So this is going to be resistant to a herbicide called Zalify. So they've rebranded. I think I got excited that I think I misspoke. Did I say accent or Assure?
Accent.
Okay. Phew. Assure. You guys have used Assure maybe if you're growing soybeans. So they just rebranded Assure as First Act. Okay. Only a grass killer, only post-emergent activity. Okay. And this approval literally just came through, like in February. So
How old was the old product?
I'm sorry.
Since you said that they relabeled or rebranded it, how old was the old product that originated? Was it?
Oh, Assure's been around at least since.
That's the problem I see with a lot of herbicides. You got.
Yeah, those are not new
Accent.
technologies, not new chemistries at
You said
all.
accent is one of them.
Accent, nicosulfuron is the newest, and it's 20 years old.
Because one thing I see is they come out with all these new herbicides and they're nothing more than old herbicides, and they either mix Banville with them, or 2,4-D with them, or something with them, or put a different active surfactant in it.
New
And so you
combinations,
ain't really
new
getting
formulations.
anything new.
Nope. So in weed science circles, we recently had kind of a splash with a herbicide called synmethylin. Old chemistry. It was actually discovered in the 80s too. It was used in rice for a while, and BASF actually isn't even planning on releasing it in the US. They're going to release it in their Australian markets. So, yeah, not a lot of new chemistry. No.
It's gonna get worse. There's not. They can't get through.
So as
Well,
we,
and the cost of putting it, the other thing is the cost of putting sorghum on the label. I know
Yeah,
we've
so-
seen that a lot in livestock. I used to raise sheep. And when they did a lot of research for cattle products, a lot of them were done on sheep because they're a smaller animal. They could put more in a chamber or whatever they were using in their test. It costs a lot less. But then when the product come out, it was labeled as beef. No sheep label on it whatsoever. Because they said at that time, that was 40 years ago, it took $1 million to put a species on the list.
yeah, so you have to have all of those herbicides, you gotta have a huge data set, environmental data, crop safety data, carryover data, residue data for the grain. So it's not an inexpensive proposition. So anyway, on the Double Team, I'm expecting to get my hands on this system this summer. I've been tentatively contacted by the Adama folks, so I'm looking forward to seeing that this summer. They're still waiting for their export approvals to go through. So they are planning on placing some of this product on farm, basically for demonstration purposes. Okay, so you may have opportunities to see some of that out and about. I've got several slides here, guys, looking at the 2020 field trials from this. I'm going to summarize them quickly. Pre-control, the Amazamox performed better than the Group 15 products on Foxtail and Hayes. Okay, so we don't have a ton of locations or years for this, but this is what we saw in Hayes last year. This is what Vipin saw in Hayes last year. Okay. Looking at crabgrass and garden, they didn't have near the pressure, the population density we would like to see there. They got really great control across the board. Okay, on those, with those trees. Okay, now post. So one of the questions I've gotten a couple of times on the IndyFlex system is, when do I use IndyFlex? Because the label is written that you can apply it either pre or post, but not both. Okay? That's going to require some strategy and decision-making for you guys. Here's what I'll tell you. You get better control pre. Okay? So we were knocking on 100% control when we applied it pre. With our IndyFlex, we're down here around 80% control when we applied it post. Now, where the thinking comes into play, we haven't seen pricing for this, so there's a possibility that maybe if you go with your 15 to get acceptable control, maybe you can save yourself the cost of that super expensive formulation. You can save it for post and decide if you don't.
You're not gonna wanna pay for it free. It'll be an expense.
Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Have you-
You're looking at what? About $3.60 a gallon. The 9-ounce rate's not gonna be a viable price. Product.
Okay.
So what happens if you use twice? Or is that just-
Sign a stewardship agreement that says you're not gonna do that.
And price point tells me you're not. gonna
Price
be able
point
to do
says
that.
you're not gonna use it free.
Okay,
And
that's more like.
free, it's gonna be a problem for free here south, I'm afraid, because ALS resistant pigweed. All the pursuit we used years ago, rec free. Hayes never saw a lot of ALS chemistry free. Gardner didn't see much either. You put it down south of here, I think it'll be a rec free.
So I think if you're counting on any of the, well, so we know that the accident insured don't have activity on it, but if you were counting on the IndyFlex for pigweed control, I would
Not do that.
not consider that.
What I'm saying is take what you get, those, we got better products to breed. Unless you're in an area that never saw pursuit. But there was a ton of pursuit, I mean, back in the day, you used a ton of pursuit, I'm sure. We used it on corn and beans. We go this way, it's gonna be a problem. That seed's still there.
So, yeah, once you get, so this is another fun question. Once you get resistance, can you get rid of it? Not really. All right, so the crabgrass and garden, again, not a ton of differences there as far as control. You guys know this, late post, not a good idea. Don't count on it for rescue for the grasses. Similarly, you know, again, they didn't have a real strong crabgrass population in garden, so we got pretty good control there across the board. Honestly, the zest in this case was a little bit less than the other two chemistries.
How you can difference between large, I suppose,
Yeah,
Oh,
so I was going too fast. I need to give you all the details. The early post was like 4-ish inches. The late post was like a foot. Okay, so 11 to 12-inch grasses there. So that's why you didn't get any control. Just reminders about the rotational restrictions. A question that I get is, tell me about IndyFlex for basically overcoming ALS carryover. So something like that. There's nothing on the label that says it's okay. I haven't seen it in the field. I'm just gonna preemptively tell you guys, because somebody will ask. The folks that are in the industry are telling me that it's okay. I have not seen it. I will not endorse that. That is what the folks in the industry are saying. Okay. Stewardship, we've already had a reference to stewardship with that 1 versus 2 application timings, but only 1 application. Stewardship is going to be super important with these. The zest label does give you 2 applications per year if you choose to go with Enzen. The other thing that they're doing for stewardship purposes, don't put sorghum back in that field. So plan on rotating away from sorghum in the 2nd year. And then This is a pretty serious deal. It may not seem like much, but avoiding avoiding locations where you know you have ALS resistant Johnson grass and shatter. If you guys look at the labels for these products, they actually don't list Johnson grass and shattercake on the labels as controlled species
In sorghum.
in sorghum.
The 4-ounce soybean rate of the same chemistry does. Go figure. That was EPA.
That was EPA, and that was EPA driving at this. Okay. Just be aware. The big thing is we don't want outcrossing. It doesn't happen super frequently, but it does happen. So we just don't want to have our grain sorghum pollinating Johnson grass or shattercake. So, cleaning up field borders, making sure that you're not letting those sorghum weeds go to flower. These are old data, but kind of addressing that question of stewardship. So this research was done out of Nebraska, but they surveyed Johnson grass and shattercane populations, primarily in Kansas and Nebraska. So any place you see color on this, so any place you see a black dot is a population that they tested. Any place you see a colored dot is a population that was resistant to either nicosulfuron, imizethapyr, or both. So the two different chemical families within ALS inhibiting herbicides. So it's out there. And again, this was published in 2016, so these data were collected 2014, 2015. So we're looking at 7-year-old data. And we all know that pollen doesn't go anywhere, right? So surely those populations have to move. Okay. So just something to think about and be aware of. So you've obviously looked at the flex system. Have you been using it this year? That's what this question was going to be. Anybody else looking at the flex this year?
I looked at his.
I would be curious. So when I ask this question, I get about 50% in other groups, I get about 50% of the respondents say either Imiflex, a little bit of Enzyme, a little bit of the double T, but I get about half of the folks usually saying they're not interested in the herbicide-resistant grain sorghum technology. I'm not asking anybody to implicate anything, but does that fit anybody in this room? Not interested in it at all? Me?
Just a little, we're using just a little bit. So we haven't had a mile since.
Yeah.
So the price has got us at the moment.
So you're gonna look at a little bit of it. So it's all of your milo and any flex, or you kind of spread it?
Just spread it out. We don't have.
Yeah, just trying to get a feel for it, so I can serve you better in the future. Somebody said we've talked about the EPA a couple of times. We still talking about it, how long you were. We've talked about our friends at the EPA a couple of times this morning. I don't know, are you guys keeping up? Are you guys keeping up with the atrazine re-registration process at all? So one of the fun things that I get to do and get asked to do a lot of times is submit letters of support for these re-registration approvals, or at the federal level, or products at the state level. But guys, it's important that the EPA hear from you. Don't think for a second that the folks that don't want to see atrazine continue to be used, y'all, they have about 3 versions of a form letter that I don't know if they pay people, if they don't have jobs, or if it's living in their parents' basements. I don't know what the deal is. But you should see the list of literally just copy and paste this form letter, okay, on those public comments. The EPA needs to hear from actual living farmers. And I don't have the website up here, but if you reach out to me, I can share that with you. Or I can share it with Kyle to share with you. Either way, okay?
So are they always after, like is there time, that's the part that I never know, is there times when it starts really becoming something that we really need to be
Yeah, so,
writing letters to them
So-
versus if it's, oh, well, it's just the normal.
yeah, so in '96, Clinton signed the Food Quality Protection Act. And part of that was that all registered products have to undergo regular re-registration to look at data that's been collected since the last time they were scrutinized. Atrazine is, got a big target on it. It's widely used in corn production, and there were some problems. I mean, I think we have to be real about the fact that there, like particularly in Iowa, right, there were some problems. I think that farmers as a whole deserve a huge pat on the back for how well they complied with the regulations and cleaned up a lot of those concerns since the 80s and 90s. But it still has a big target on its back. And so right now, atrazine is in the middle of one of those re-registration periods. And so there's an open comment period right now. It actually, I'll have to go back and get all the dates and get the emails or the website where you guys can go through the comments. Like I said, I'll be happy to submit that. I could share that with you individually or share it with Kyle. But right now, atrazine is getting re-registered. And so there's an opportunity to have your poster.
What's the length of a registration?
So it's
Or is that
every,
very chemical?
so what the EPA does is they grant a full label that's good for 5 years. But then we have this re-registration review every 10. The FQPA said every 10. They have to have their registration. And they started, when they passed this in '96, they started with the ones of most concern. So this is already the second time that atrazine has been through this process. I was an undergrad the first time it was, and I had truckloads of data to try to make a case that we need to keep it. So I'm a little bit invested in this thing. All right, what you got, Lucas?
This came up earlier, sir, just comment on that is what typically, in previous processes, crops, we've already given up a lot of atrazine in minor crops. And so they just kind of keep, in order to try and get their full load down in the environment, they just keep dropping things off the label. So for us, in the far west, in Colorado, Nebraska, a huge issue was we lost the atrazine label for roasted milk. That was basically our only residual herbicide option. But in the last review process, they were trying to cut down on this label and cut down how many pounds of atrazine were being applied nationwide. We lost millet and several other minor crops. So I guess that's what concerns me is, okay, at what point do we give enough stuff up that now sorghum's at the bottom of this? And it's the next one. It's really problematic.
It is a problem. And the current political environment is going to be particularly tough on stuff like this. Not to talk politics among friends, but it's going to be tougher for some of these products to do what they need to do. Atrazine, glyphosate still has a target on its back. All the stuff going on with dicamba right now, it's bad news for crop protection chemicals. We'll talk philosophy over a beer sometime, not right now. All right. So 2021 chemical control guide. Kyle, have you got yours?
Yes.
Okay, so see Kyle to get one. If you're an electronic person, you can download it. And then you guys, this has been my most fun extension project so far. I started a podcast with some friends of mine. So once a week, we just sit down and visit with somebody about some aspect of integrated weed management. I don't remember who said it. I think it was you. There's no new chemistries, right? Yeah. So one of the first episodes we did is just all about why there's no new silver bullets. So we try to be practical. We have talked to some crop consultants. We've got an episode with a farmer coming out. So try to give you guys some things to think about, some things to do, and also kind of let you see behind the curtain a little bit of what we do as weed scientists and how we think about things and the things that we're working on. So it's on iTunes, it's on Google Play, it's on Spotify. If you have people that are 30 or younger in your life, they can, I'm sure, hook you up with any of those things. Okay. But it's been a ton of fun, and I hope that it's useful for y'all and y'all can enjoy it. So my goal was, you guys spend a lot of time in the tractor, like, I grew up in the tractor, and my dad was in the part of all games, right? So it's something y'all can listen to, because when you get tired of hearing the same song in country music on it. Okay. All right, so my contact information here, email, Twitter, Facebook. Thank you guys for talking back and being in this group. This was fun for me to get out, and I hope that I shared some things with you to think about some things that will be helpful to you guys. And please do reach out. Like I said, I confess, I'm still learning what y'all do and how you do it and how I can best serve you. So that's what I'm about. So I welcome feedback and comments. And before I spend all morning talking, because I will, stop, I'm gonna stop.
We got time for questions. Anyone's got?
Are you planning on staying in Kansas when you get done? And where are you?
When I get done, y'all gonna be done with me with this. I think that was a compliment. Is that a compliment? This is not a student. So I grew up in Missouri. My dad farmed about an hour west of corn, soybeans, cattle, are typical for that area. My brother is home from Houston. I love it. It's been different. I love my job. I love what I'm doing. So tell Lucas and his other friends decided that. So hey, thanks guys.
They haven't got tired of me yet, so there's. Okay, Kyle, appreciate the opportunity to come down this morning. Sure.
So this is Lucas Hags. He is a Northwest area agronomist out of Colby. Southwest area does not have an agronomist right now, so we get to use Lucas.
Yeah,
We're trying to
cover it all. So I get a cover a pretty decent swath of the state right now, and it's kind of funny. My program has also become the home of obscure and alternative crops. It seems like too. So we dabble in industrial hemp. I'm involved in our cotton work, and then we also do full season legumes like field peas and chickpea and dried bean. So a little bit of everything. I here earlier a couple weeks ago was on a deal with a bunch of people out of Canada, the Northern Plains, on this pulse crop thing, and I said, well, so last week I was in the Southwest Cotton Physiology group, so I guess that's the joy of doing dabbling in a little bit of everything. So I'm going to hit just kind of some high points. I picked up that we maybe got some folks that haven't grown sorghum in a number of years, looking at going back to it. And so we'll try and, some of this maybe basic knowledge, but some things to think about anyways. And then a lot of the field data, we're kind of in a little bit of a spot here. A lot of the field data I have is further west. And so we kind of think about how we might apply it to this part of the world. I recognize that it's a little different. I think it's still important to think about what are the key growth stages in terms of sorghum when we're thinking about growth and development, what's contributing to yield, okay? How many of you here grow corn? Okay, everyone, that's what we figured, right? So let's think about, there's some similarities here, okay? We think about when's our first really critical growth stage in corn in terms of setting yield potential? About when? B what? B5, right? So what are we setting at B5? Maximum potential number of rows, kernel rows, okay? And then in corn, when we get longer on, when we're at basically tassel into brown silk, then what are we setting? Our maximum potential number of kernels per year row, right? And then we finish it up with grain. We've got some similar stages in sorghum. And so the first key one is generally about 30 days after emergence, okay? And that would be that equivalent to B5 in corn. And that's when we're setting maximum number of kernels per head. We're setting that at about 30 days after emergence. This is why, from a herbicide timing standpoint, we want to be careful with that growth stage in terms of putting that plant under stress. Anyone in here irrigating sorghum or thinking about irrigating? Okay, so this is where, again, if I, from a limited irrigation scenario, if I have, 3 inches or 5 inches of water to use in the season,
I'm gonna put some of that on to make sure we're under no stress going into that growing point differentiation. So if I only had 3 irrigations on sorghum, it'd be at 30, 60, and 90 days. Growing point differentiation, food, grain. And so, again, keep coinciding with those key points of determining yield. So then obviously, boot, kind of being that next critical stage, that's when we really are going into rapid growth and uptake in terms of dry matter accumulation, the rate at which we're uptaking nitrogen and phos. And then our next key point, basically half bloom, starting that process of grain fill and hoping that between the environment and our management, we do everything we can to prolong that grain fill period the best we can. Because there's really, if you think about, so growing point differentiation, that's setting our maximum number. And then in terms of stress, again, a half bloom, we start to cut back on seeds per head. And then what happens after that is affecting kernel weight. The other thing I'll point out, I'm going to assume that folks in Pawnee County are a lot sharper than folks in Ellis County, just for give everyone the benefit of the doubt. I give Stacy Campbell, the ag agent up there, a really bad time because inevitably every year I get called out somewhere in Ellis County on a call where somebody has dinged the hell out of their sorghum because they went out and put 2,4-D or dicamba on 8-inch tall sorghum. So we got to, and again, that goes back into where we're hitting growth stages. And if we're at boot still out there with 2,4-D, we're going to cause some damage. We're going to cause some injury. And so being aware of that. We got a nice animation there. Okay. You've probably seen these cutaways before, but this is always kind of interesting just to, being able to, we can always, similar to corn, we can cut open the sorghum stalk, look at where our nodes are. And we can always find the growing point. That's obviously what's going to turn into the head at some point. What actually contributes to yield? Well, the biggest driver, just like kernels per plant, is in corn. Seeds per head is our biggest driver in sorghum, followed by heads per acre, and seed weight being kind of the factor that has the least amount of sway in terms of final yield. This is just another way of looking at it. We looked at the relationship between, this is some of Ignacio's data, looking at various studies across the state. Pretty nice relationship, seeds per head versus grain yield. That's pretty clear what's driving yield there. If we look at seed weight, slightly positive, but we can have a wide range of grain yields and have basically the same amount of seed weight. So it's really kernels per head that's driving yield potential. Okay, why is sorghum well adapted, especially in central Kansas? Well, we've got drought tolerance and drought avoidance. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. Okay, and so if we think about the mechanism that allows sorghum to perform well in these tough environments, drought tolerance is that ability to maintain growth during periods of water stress, as opposed to drought avoidance, where the plant actually alters itself, either has some different characteristics or the ability to alter itself to survive a period of water stress. So here's some trivia you can share next time you get together for a garden party with your neighbors. Here's some trivia you can share. Sorghum has 50% more stomata. Okay, those are those openings on the leaf where we let water vapor out, pull carbon dioxide in. Sorghum has 50% more stomata per square inch of leaf than corn does. Okay. Now, part of that is they're much smaller. And so what that allows sorghum to do is it allows it to much more tightly regulate that exchange of water vapor and CO2. So when we get into really stressful conditions, it can really ratchet that down and tighten down how much water vapor is leaving the plant. It can regulate it more finely, more fine-tuned than what corn does. Extensive root system. If we think about it's got a relatively small leaf to root ratio. Okay, so that in terms of the amount of above ground biomass we're trying to support with the root system underground, it's got an advantage there. Perfect flowers. We don't have to rely on pollen to get from here to here. It's all self-contained. And then the more recent thing we've seen come through the seed industry has been the introduction of more stay green type characteristics. So as we get, really the key to that is as we move towards senescence, that plant's ability to maintain favorable water status, favorable nitrogen status in the plant, so that stay green, we keep the leaves greener, which lets us finish that grain field process more strongly. Not all hybrids on the market today have that. I don't know, Charlie, how well that's documented, if companies are actually saying what does and doesn't have stay green trait in it.
I think about 10 years ago, they quit kind of documenting that.
Okay.
I haven't seen anything promoted about that in a long time.
Yeah, in terms of actually designating that.
I think somebody does or has trademarked the stay green moniker, and so maybe that's why we're not seeing it anymore. Nobody talks about it.
Yeah, that could be. You know, I think we probably gravitate to these things with stay green, especially in this environment, because I think all in all, they're going to be things that have better standability. And they're just going to finish better in the season. And so we're going to pick those things up due to yield and standability, which obviously two things should be probably our number one and number two reasons for picking a hybrid. Drought avoidance, sorghum's got a heavy wax layer on the leaves. We can adjust maturity when under stress. That can work pretty well down here. Up at Colby, that can get us into trouble sometimes. You know, if we think about our more thermally limited environments, if we wait, it's just sitting there to push a head out or to finish. Well, if we wait too long, we run out of heat units, and we freeze it to death before we make grain. So that can be a challenge. So we've got some management options. We think of row spacing, plant population, and we're going to hit just on a few of these things here. You know, the one thing that I think we often misunderstand is crop water use. Okay. And we tend to think of it in this type of framework. Well, if I've got one plant here and it uses 1,000 grams of water a day, then two plants must use 2,000 grams of water per day, right? Okay, if I plant something twice as thick, it's going to use twice as much water. Well, if they're completely isolated plants, that's probably correct, but we don't grow isolated plants. We grow plants in a community, right? Okay, there's a lot of overlapping of leaves or shading of leaves. And the key thing that we sometimes lose is that water use is really driven by light interception. Okay, if I've got a leaf out there and it's intercepting light, it's got to burn water to deal with that. Okay, so if I've got isolated plants, that's one thing, but if I've got plants planted in a row, they're overlapping, not every bit of leaf area is intercepting sunlight, right? And so that's why when we go from, if you plant, sorghum planted at 60,000 seed per acre is not going to use 2x the water as sorghum planted at 30,000. Okay? It's not that simple, because really it comes down to, scoot ahead here. I don't have the slide in here I want. Basically, we think about leaf area index. We look at light interception as leaf area increases. When we get to an LAI of 3, that means I've got 3 square feet of leaf for every square foot of ground it's over. Okay. When we get to that point, there's virtually no light hitting the ground. Okay, what do we call that? For out in the field, we say we've hit what? Full canopy, right? Okay. And so at that point, so really the only difference in water use comes in that time period from planting to when you reach full canopy. Once you're at full canopy, you're intercepting all the light. You're burning the amount of water it's going to take to deal with that. And so there's no difference. Sorghum planted at 30,000, sorghum planted at 60,000. Once they reach full canopy, there's no difference in how much water they're using. Okay? So it's really about how fast we get to that point.
What's your opinion on planting population?
Yeah, so we'll come back around to that, Charlie. That's a good question. In general, so the big picture of this is, okay, in crop production, if we're managing fertility, if we're managing pests, we're doing all these other things, we're limited by one of two things. We're either water limited or we're light limited. Okay. In dry land production in Kansas, which one of those do you think we are? Water limited, right? Okay. Let's think about, as an example, narrow row corn and all the focus and excitement there was on narrow row corn for a lot of years. The most consistent responses out of narrow row corn, you have to get north of I-80, and you have to get east of Omaha. And the further north, the further east you go, the more consistent response you get out of narrow row corn. Why is that? We're moving into an environment where you are more light limiting than you are water limiting, right? Okay, and so we get a benefit of having more leaves out there earlier, converting sunlight into biomass, because water is not our limiting factor. As opposed to some of the work we've done out of Tribune and folks we've worked with in Eastern Colorado, Texas Panhandle, we've looked at skip row corn or skip row sorghum, plump sorghum. We're taking the opposite approach. We've got too much light for the water we have. And so we're wanting to intercept less light with the idea that we'll have a better chance of making the crop. So two different sides to the same coin. Are we water limited or are we light limited? So that brings us to the question of row spacing, and seeding rate plays a role in this as well too. So here's some old data that was done at, actually they ran trials. This is kind of an interesting study, two very different locations, Tribune and Hutch, back in the mid 80s, looking at sorghum planted on 10s and on 30s over a pretty wide range of seeding rates there. And actually in that scenario, pretty similar relationship between the two locations. We'll look at the yield levels. Our peak sorghum yields were around 60 bushel, okay? As opposed to, there's a study that was done in Manhattan here more recently over a very wide range of seeding rates on 10, 20, and 30s. Now we can start to see that interaction between seeding rate and row spacing show up. Where, by going from 30s either to 10s or 20s, we picked up a significant bump in yield and a bit of a positive response to increased seeding rate. But look at the yield environment we're in, right? We're talking 130, 150 bushel sorghum. So matching our row spacing and our planting density for the environment. What can the environment support? And so looking across basically all of the studies that we've done in Kansas over the years, we look at, okay, where's that break point between 30-inch or something narrower? So this is the 10 or the 20-inch data lumped together. I think there's even some 15 in there too. So if we think, okay, at what yield level does, if we plot narrow row yield versus 30-inch, where's that breakover point at? And that's kind of what it looks like, okay? So each dot represents a site here where the comparison was made. So here's when we made 150 bushel in 30-inch rows, look at this site here, 140 bushel and 30-inch rows, we were doing about 160 in narrow rows, okay? If you take all of that and look at for where's that breakover point at, it works out to about 70 bushel. In environments where we think that we're going to consistently raise more than a 70 bushel sorghum yield, we see an advantage to narrow rows, okay? Now that advantage, if we're at 80 bushel, that advantage is going to be a lot smaller than if we're at 150 bushel, right? Okay, that advantage to narrow rows gets larger as our yield potential goes up. Because that basically means we've got the water to support a higher yield. And so that means we need to intercept the light in order to use that water. So that's where we get that benefit from the narrow spacing or more plants per acre. Is this any questions, or am I making sense?
Only thing I see with the higher population, or this is my philosophy, maybe it's wrong, is you can canopy faster because you're putting more plants out there. Although if you got a variety that can really do a tremendous amount of tillering, why it would do probably the same thing. But by canopy, why then you can shade out any weeds that could be competing. Plus, to me, you can add to that final yield if you got enough moisture and enough nutrients in the ground
To support it.
to support it.
Yeah, so you hit on a couple of important topics. We're going to revisit the tillering thing here in a minute, because that's the other thing that really complicates this. And the weed control thing is a new piece to this, right? And so that's really, we've got, I guess, my experience is even out west, we've got a lot of guys considering narrow rows now, and they're doing it more from a weed control aspect than a production aspect. You know, what's the other thing that's changed? We've got a lot better seeding equipment today to be able to do narrow rows. You know, a lot of our grain drills that we might have tried drilling sorghum with 15, 20 years ago, we didn't have the resolution we needed in the metering system to slow either small enough rollers or being able to slow that down enough to get consistent metering. But now, you know, even like on the, you know, the deer air cards, you put in that smallest set of rolls in there and you can turn them slow enough, they do a pretty nice job at the rates we need them to do. So we've had, you know, the seeding equipment's changed a lot. The weed control aspect, I think, is playing a role as well. Okay, so I'm glad you brought up the tillering, Neil. I think this is, from a production standpoint, I would argue, this is probably some of the oldest data I'm going to show, but I also I would argue this might be the most important slide I show this morning. So this is some work from when we used to have the Sandyland field in St. John. And so this is looking at 3 different seeding rates, okay? I think it was 20, 25, 50, and 75,000 is what the low, medium, and high is here, okay? At these 4 different planting dates, okay? Now, what you see in yellow, okay, represents what the tiller's contribution to final yield was. What you see in the color is what the main stock provided. Okay, so just as an example, let's start here on May 3rd. Okay, so the green bar, this is the low seeding rate, purple's medium seeding rate, gray is the high seeding rate. The colored portion is what came off the main stem. The yellow portion of the bar is what was contributed from the tillers. Okay, and so not terribly surprising here, but I think this really comes back. I think in recent years, there's several times when we found ourselves in a late plant situation, especially here in central Kansas, where I wonder if we maybe left yield on the table. Are we adjusting our seeding rates as we should be as our planting window gets delayed? This is really no different than what we talk about on winter wheat, right? Okay, we generally say for every week we get past our optimal seeding rate, or excuse me, seeding date on winter wheat, we should be bumping our seeding rate by about 10%. Why is that? As we move our planting on the wheat, as we move our planting date later and later, what window of opportunity is closing? Our ability to set fall tillers, right? Which are productive tillers in wheat. We've got the same thing going here in sorghum. As we move that planting date later and later, our opportunity to have productive tillers, that window is closing on us, okay? And it can actually go back against us. We have a low seeding rate planted on June 6th. We still might set a bunch of tillers, but are they going to make productive grain? Or are they going to be green suckerheads out there that stay wet and slow down our harvesting? And so it can come back to hurt us on the other side. And so anyways, just look, as we move planting dates across, just look at how that tiller contribution changes, okay? And so what do we have to do to maintain the same yield potential? Well, if we can get by with a pretty low seeding rate at an early planting date because the tillers are going to make up the difference. As we move later and later, we probably need to think about adjusting that seeding rate because the tillers aren't going to be there to carry any load for us. Does this kind of come back to what you're getting at a little bit? Yeah, Charlie.
That's interesting. Have they looked at redoing that? Because I mean,
We need to.
our climate is different, whether lower or whatever, but our timings are different than they would have definitely been in '79. But I'm shocked that you're seeing the difference
So,
all the way
yeah,
up to June 6th.
and this would have been an average of 3 years. So I'm guessing this would have been the average of like 77, 78, and 79.
Because on the 6th, you should have plenty of time. At least now we would figure you'd have plenty of time to finish. But that's kind of, it's interesting.
Yeah, well, I don't think this disputes that because actually, look, our highest yields are the high seeding rate planted June 6th.
But you're still not getting any tillers on June 6th.
Yeah.
Which is surprising.
And I think there's probably, I'm sure there's a hybrid piece to this too. We know there's we know different sorghum hybrids have different propensities to tillering, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm sure there's a hybrid piece to this as well. But I guess in general, I think increasing our seeding rates with later planting dates is something. We've not repeated this study exactly, but I can tell you at Colby and some other trials, we've done the same general relationship, I think is still there. So.
What would you call low population? High, medium?
So in this study, I'm pretty sure it's 25, 50, and 75,000 was what they used on this. So, 25 is pretty low. I mean, we got some guys out around Elkhart that will plant that, but they know you're really relying on the tillers to carry the day if you're going to raise much more than 50 bushel sorghum. So it's really about, I guess my point is we don't want seeding rate to become, if we find ourselves in a late planted situation, we don't want us to cap our yield potential from the get-go by having too low of a seeding rate out there. And as we move to a later planting date, that becomes a more realistic possibility.
So you're May the 3rd, ground temperatures below 50.
Probably.
Not with what I sold you.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And going back to think about everything that's changed since this work was done, there's no doubt our seed today has better cold vigor. The hybrids have better cold emergence vigor, but still not to the point where we want to be planting at 50-degree soil temps.
I've had an irrigated circle milo. Is there any point in there that stressing would increase the yield or not?
I'm sorry, say that again.
So if I had an irrigated circle of milo, is there any point in there that stressing it would increase the yield or not?
I don't think, there's some times we can, like in a limited irrigation situation, there's some times we can stress it without hurting the yield. I guess I can't think of a scenario where stressing it would actually increase the yield.
Just keep it back like a little more.
I don't think we probably know. Especially in the vegetative stages, we can let it go, really early on. If we got time, I can come back to that. We've got some work on that shows, basically the time to stress it is other than that 30 days after planting, that vegetative stage leading up to boot, that's really the time we can short it a little bit and not hurt ourselves, as long as we're not bad at that 30 days after time period. We can actually cut back to about a 40% deficit on it as long as we've got the ability to put that water back on, 7 days prior to boot and then forward. So, okay. Anyways, just some thoughts on that. I think that's something to keep in mind. We've talked about the soil temperature deal. We kind of hashed this all over already. When are we trying to head by? Certainly by mid-late August. Thinking about next crop, how many of you planting sorghum would like to try and get it back to wheat yet this fall? Is that in anybody's plans? Okay, so matching maturities to that. We've done some work looking at, does it make any difference to terminate with glyphosate? There's a lot of talk of alleopathy from sorghum going back to wheat. It's really hard to tease apart. Is it really alleopathy or is it nitrogen type? That's a really hard thing to pull apart. And so if you do plan on going back with wheat in the fall, I really think you need to consider trying to get some nitrogen on at planting or nearby to help get that wheat going. Because I think a lot of times we blame it on alleopathy, and it's really the fact we've got a lot of high seed-in ratio residue out there tying up nitrogen.
You mentioned the Roundup. Are you seeing any yield advantage with Roundup terminating that?
On the sorghum?
On sorghum, yeah.
No, but in the situations where that was done, we were still able to harvest it in a fairly timely manner. So I don't think we were saving ourselves much in terms of harvest, pre-harvest.
I've seen some stuff out of OSU that was showing an advantage, which it's nice.
Yeah, and I think there certainly could be. I think hybrid selection interacts with that quite a bit. If you got something that's got pretty.
You have a lot. Now I don't do it, but if you have a lot of suckers, if you went through a bad stress, and because we have years where you'll have I call it the first crop milo will come up and head and start turning, and here you get these heads that pop up And then those end up making it so late to try to harvest, that using the Roundup to kill those, in order to get the crop out.
Yeah.
Versus waiting another 3 weeks or a month sometimes or more.
Yeah, I think that's a scenario where it could pay is we've got a bunch of them late heads coming and we know they're not harvestable, they're not gonna be harvestable, but they're in the way of us getting the crop out. I think that's where that lifestyle application would pay. Especially if we've had some late season stress and we're a little bit concerned about the stock integrity, of the plant and is it gonna, how much longer is it gonna stand? Okay, switching gears just a little bit on fertility.
Yeah, 6 o'clock.
Still 6 o'clock.
You got plenty of time.
That's it.
Just a few points here, nitrogen management. I think this is worth thinking, just again, kind of when are we uptaking that? For you folks they're thinking about some irrigated, and especially on the sand, thinking about I don't know if you're set up to fertigate, but I certainly think there's some opportunities here to better manage our nitrogen to kind of, hit this rapid uptake. So here we are at half bloom. Again, we said 30 days here, that's panicle initiation, but then really coming into boots where we're uptaking stuff pretty fast. And so if we can time, if we have the ability to fertigate, certainly a little bit early on. But on the sand, I wouldn't front load it very heavy, probably no different what you guys are doing with your corn, a little bit early and then plan to spoon feed it later. On dry land, we don't have many folks that side dress, but again, if you can come in at about 8, 9, 10 leaf stage, if you're wanting to do some split application. On dry land, I would always rather cheat it a little early because in dry land, it's not the day we apply the nitrogen, it's the day we get the rain to move it into the ground, right? And so we don't want to get caught on the back side of that and be short. Especially if we're on the hard ground, it's not going to go anywhere anyway. So here's our current recommendation. So yield goal times 1.6 pounds per bushel. And sometimes there's some misunderstanding about our recommendations. So that front part of it, what we're getting at is this is not crop removal. This is total uptake. Okay. This is what we say the total pounds and in that plant has to uptake in order to meet that goal. Now it's not all going to be removed. A lot of that's going to be returned to the soil through the residue. But 1.6 times yield goal, for every percent soil organic matter, we get a 20-pound credit for mineralization. Okay, and then hopefully we've got a profile nitrate sample, a 2-foot sample, we can subtract that off as well. So this is what the chart looks like. You've got 120 bushel yield goal on a 2% OM soil. We're going to be right around that 122 pounds. That assumes 30 pounds in the profile, but obviously that number could be 5 and that number could be 300. We see it all. So
I know my dad turned it great because how much nitrogen we're pouring into some of these crops.
we're raising a lot better crops there too, aren't we?
Or at least we're attempting to. But it seems like, every time I get my soil samples back, even on wheat, to hit 50 bushel yield, I've got some that are calling for 90 pound ban. My dad, he shook in his boots and put 30 pounds on,
So here's the good news is it is changing. This will be our revision starting this next year. Our recommendation is actually going down a little bit. But there's some other caveats that are coming into this. And so buried in this 1.6 is an implied efficiency of about 50%. In other words, we're going to recover about 50% of the nitrogen we apply. On average, that's most of our guys are doing better than that, okay, today. So what we decided to do is to actually split this out and let you pick your own efficiency based on your soil types and how you're putting on the end. Okay, so moving forward, we're going to be at 1.2 pounds per bushel uptake, but then you're going to plug in your own efficiency. So if we're placing it below the soil surface or we're doing split apply, it's a 70% efficient. If we're doing some sort of pre-plant application, 65% efficient. And then say we're doing fall application or like a broadcast dry urea, then that's gonna be a 55% efficiency. And so we're gonna give more flexibility, try and give you a better recommendation. Instead of just giving the same general deal to everybody, try and let you fine tune it to your own practices and give you a recommendation that's a little more specific. Same way on your profile in sample. If you're medium textured soil or Western Kansas, so if you're on like the hard ground up here, we're gonna give that its full value. If you're on a coarser textured soil or in Eastern Kansas, we're only gonna give 70% of the value to what's in your profile sample. Because we figure that's what you're actually gonna be able to recover out of that by the crop.
Where do they feel those lines are at? Do they have any kind of?
Yeah, we're arguing about that internally right now. I shouldn't say arguing, discussing, trying to figure out, I would probably put that line somewhere on 281 or 81. So either Pratt or Wichita is where I would put it. If we're gonna divide it into east and west. This is our first step. Our idea really is as we get more data, break it out even more specifically. And so, I can see a day where we kind of have a West Central Kansas deal that this strip of the world would fall into versus a far west versus, east.
Well, you almost need to apply that north to south too, because it seems like that, the last few years, rainfall seems to run very much parallel with either I-70. I don't know where you call it, south of here, down around 54 highway. Of course, I know it curves down to the Liberal, but that makes a world of difference where the rainfall is.
Yeah, so when we get those big drought events, like thinking back to 11 and 12, right, we definitely seen there's a very strong north-south difference there as that drought, moved a lot further north in 12 than what it was in 11. But in general, when we look at the long-term data, it's still a pretty strong east to west gradient, basically what, an inch every 30 miles roughly. Anyway, we're going to break it out further, but this is our first step at it to try and give a more, a more grower specific recommendation to their practices. So the good news is, for the growers, if you got the ability to put it in the ground, or if you're on tighter ground, our recommendation is going to reward you for that, and we're going to recognize the more challenging, the less efficient practices like fall application or broadcast urea. We're going to make sure that that's taken into account as well. So we mentioned this a little bit. How many of you are doing some cover cropping? Anybody here? I know Kyle, we've got some meetings on that. So I always remind people, be aware of the residue you're going back into. We talked about this in terms of wheat going back into sorghum stocks, but if you're going to plant sorghum, I know we got some folks in Barton County looking at sorghum back into different cover crops. Just be aware if you've got a lot of rye residue or triticale residue out there, that's probably got a fair bit of nitrogen tied up in it. And so we're going to have to be a little more conscious about trying to front load some in, making sure that sorghum is not deficient early on. So wheat stubble and grain sorghum residue are both about the same, an 80-to-1 seed-in ratio. So we always think about how much in we can tie up in wheat stubble. We can tie up just as much of that in sorghum residue as well. Corn stalks are a little bit less, 60-to-1. Wood chips, 200-to-1, just for an interesting comparison there. CRP grass typically is about 100 or 120. We ran into that. Some guys trying to break out CRP. There's still sorghum responds well to any pop-up. Especially if you've got N and P co-mix, they'll tend to move together a little bit there in the soil. We see generally equal responses to either like a 2x2 placement or a surface dribble. We tend to see fairly similar responses to those two in terms of the starter effect. And when I'm talking about dribblings, that's basically like a 2x0, 2 to 3 inches over from the seed trench. If you're gonna do some in-furrow starter with sorghum, keep in mind you want no more than, like, using just straight 1034 or some of the other products, no more than 10 pounds of N or potash per acre in furrow. That's when we start to run into issues. And never any urea or UAN in furrow. That's almost, we can guarantee you're gonna have problems there. And this 10-pound limit, if you guys on the sand, we probably need to back that down a little bit, close to 5 to 6 pounds. To keep from, I don't know, what do you guys typically running? What type of starter package, like on your corn, are you typically running? Okay. What's your in furrow rate typically?
4 gallons, that's 3.
You're splitting it in the, okay. Is that 1034 or especially? Okay. So yeah, that'd be a similarly good.
We're running 5 gallon, but then we're also putting zinc. Is there any reaction with zinc and sulfur, putting it in row?
No, for any reasonable rate, we're gonna be pretty safe on those. Yeah. So the salt you're probably putting on is ammonium thiosulfate, ATS blended in, ammonium thiosulfate. Okay. Was it 120026?
Yeah.
So yeah, we've talked about this a lot. Just be aware, now's a good time to get some liquid on. Hopefully, get some moisture moving in. Keep in mind, I don't know what your guys' market's been down here, but in Northwest this year, this year and last year it's been odd. We can buy UAN cheaper than we buy dry urea on a per pound of in basis. Same here, and that's a good thing because the first thing you get. Anyone know what UAN stands for? Urea, ammonium nitrate, right? And back in the days when we could actually buy ammonium nitrate, what was its biggest benefit? What's its volatilization potential? Ammonium nitrate won't volatilize like urea will. And so if you can put on UAN, you've already got half the volatilization potential is putting on dry urea. You're basically getting a stabilizer product for free. Okay. And if you mix a little sulfur with it, we do some UAN with some ATS, sulfur will also help reduce that volatilization process. So there's really some opportunities there. If you've got the flexibility to shift between dry or liquid, if you got the ability to use UAN, not only is it cheaper per pound of N basis as of late, but it's less likely to volatilize. And if you need to get some sulfur in the system, it's a nice way to add some ATS as well and further safen that problem. Of course, anhydride, I don't know, is that still pretty, you guys still a lot of anhydride used down here or not? Okay. I know a lot of areas it's basically been pulled out. No one can afford, none of our retailers can afford the insurance. Okay, micros, I don't know how much time to spend on this. Do you guys fight iron chlorosis issues in your sorghum? Is that a concern to anybody here?
Not so much here as you go northward, but.
Okay. So basically, the short story is if you got iron chlorosis, the best product out there on the market is the Ortho EDHA chelates. So Soy Green is the first name brand on the market. There's various generics out there now. 3 pounds per acre is basically what all our data shows has been sufficient to maximize that benefit. So that's really our answer there. That, and along with your number one option, is still hybrid selection. That's still the best tool we have for iron chlorosis in sorghum and soybeans, for that matter, is making sure we're picking the right hybrid, the right variety. One other thing I would pay attention to in this part of the world, you guys are having your profile, your 2-foot samples pulled, is historically maybe we've only ran those for nitrate. It doesn't cost much more, but I would also be running them for sulfur and chloride. We see the line of where, typically chloride has been an Eastern Kansas thing, but the line of which we're starting to see chloride responses is moving west. Okay, especially if you've got ground with a long irrigated history. Okay, history of high yields and high removal. Chloride is mobile in the soil. Over time, we can leach some of it out, and then also removal from the crop. And so even in wheat and sorghum as far west as like Osborne and Smith County now in north central Kansas, Kansas, we're seeing responses to chloride. Chloride soil test is pretty good, and it typically doesn't cost much to add it on if you're already running those 2-foot samples. And the other thing is, it gives you an idea of where you're at on sulfur. Sorghum is not going to be our most responsive crop to sulfur, but if you've got wheat in the rotation, it's a good opportunity to look at what's in there, because wheat will respond to sulfur. This is all just iron corrosive stuff. I'm going to skip through this. I'll just point out the value of variety selection, hybrid selection. Y40 we know is not good for iron corrosives. G32 tends to be a little bit better. So this is the check. This is with no iron applied. Just the difference in picking the right hybrid mix. And I know Charlie, all the companies in their lineup know what is and isn't going to be a good fit for a high pH iron chlorosis type scenario. 60 days after planting, this is the type of response we were getting. This is from the 6-pound grade of that iron chelate. It doesn't take you back to 100%, but it's certainly a lot better than doing nothing, and that's on a fairly susceptible hybrid. Again, the 3-pound rate was getting us most of the benefit. Going to the 6 pounds or 6-pound split really wasn't adding much. This is a pretty tough situation. Similar stuff under irrigation. Y40 still is not very good on high pH. So here's where, okay, the 3 pounds product, yeah, helped us, but poor hybrid selection for high pH is still showing through there. There's no amount of product that helps overcome the fact that we picked a pretty susceptible hybrid for iron chlorosis, as opposed to something that we knew was good on iron chlorosis. That product helped us out quite a bit there. The other thing you'll notice here is the difference in maturity. Look how much further along we are, and at 3,800 feet of elevation at tribute, this could quite likely be the difference from cutting a crop and not. In terms of when the freeze comes. We looked at some dry humic acid in furrow. We had guys telling us they thought they were seeing some benefit to that. We did it at 3 locations, used some ridiculously high rates, all the way from 0 to 210 pounds per acre of this dry humate. There's kind of the one location we had a range of sites at. Then this is a Colby on some ground that been leveled for flood back in the day. And basically we saw nothing, no visual response, no yield response. And so that was pretty disappointing to us, but we'd like to revisit it. But at least that year we saw at those 4 sites, we saw no response. Here's the chloride work. This is some Dorovar stuff. This is an average of 8 sites, mostly in central Kansas. So there's tissue results. Chloride rate 0 up to 30 pounds, flag leaf. So we are getting it into the plant when we're putting it on. Here's the yield response. And these are, so 5 of the 8 sites did have a soil test level of less than 6 parts per million. So we would have expected them to be responsive to chloride. And so we are picking up, this is a pretty modest, only a couple bushel here when you average across sites. Buried in here are some sites where we were picking up some 5 and 10 bushel responses. 10 pounds has been enough to do it. We've never seen a response to anything above 10 pounds.
So what was the chloride level at 6 parts per million?
So 6 is that threshold where we'd expect to see a response.
Okay.
The lower you are, obviously the bigger response we'd expect to see.
Is there other things that play into that?
Well, so there's lots of things that will affect that soil test level. I mean, soil type, obviously coarser soils were more likely to leach it out. Low organic matter soils are going to have less chloride. The other part of this I didn't mention, the reason we're seeing this change is further east of us where they have a history of putting on potash. How is most potash put on? Dry, which is potassium chloride. And so those areas where they routinely put potash on, they're getting plenty of chloride because they're putting potash on and the chloride's coming along dry. But we're in this area where we don't have a history of potash application, but yet over time we've lost some chloride out of our system. We're kind of in this in between zone, here in central western
this in Kansas. Could that be the reason why alfalfa responds well if you need to put potash on prior to planting alfalfa?
Yeah, because think about in the alfalfa scenario, we're removing alfalfa, silage would be another example, anywhere where we're removing the entire crop. As opposed to, so like in our grain crops, corn, sorghum, wheat, soybean, very little chloride is removed in the grain. Most of it stays in the plant, so we're returning it to the system. But in a silage scenario or an alfalfa scenario, we're removing the whole plant. We're mining some chloride over time. So, okay. That's really what I've got there. We're kind of out of time, Kyle, to get you finished at noon. I guess I will show just some things. This is maybe too far west to think about, but a few things as you're thinking about rotations on dry land. This is 10 years out of the 30-year trial at Tribune. Basically, anytime we got sorghum after wheat stubble, we're getting higher yields than when we're recropping. Okay, not surprising. What is that number? On average, anytime we're recropping a row crop, be it sorghum or corn, within the same year, it's making about 70% of what it would have made planted into wheat stubble. Okay, in terms of first crop versus second crop. And so, from a budgeting standpoint, that's kind of what is a decent thing to use to kind of pencil things out. I don't know. Does that sound right here? If you've got sorghum and wheat sorghum fallow versus sorghum after sorghum, you ain't gonna make 70% of, or is it narrower than that here?
I don't think we've seen it with corn sorghum rotation on a continuous summer crop, but I sure see it on sorghum and sorghum.
Okay. So if you've got second year corn,
Yeah, I don't see it.
it makes about the same as first year corn. Okay. It's interesting.
We had some mile this last year that was sorghum on sorghum. And last year made 114, this year made 135. And that was sorghum on sorghum, but that.
You got one more rain.
And then that's quite possible, that's our problem out here, a mile or two can make a lot of difference just because of rainfall.
I will show just a little bit of our tillage data. We've got a long-term tillage trial out there that dates back to 91. So we've got full 100% no-till, a conventional till, and a reduced till. In the early years of the study, there was this is all wheat, sorghum, fallow. In the early years of the study, there was some tillage in between both after wheat harvest and after sorghum harvest. Starting in 01, we changed it to where the only tillage is ahead of wheat drilling. Okay, the sorghum is always is all no-till planted into the wheat stubble and the reduced till. Now the conventional till, there's still tillage in both places. There's our sorghum yields in the first 5 years of the study. Then the next 5 years of the study, you hear people talk about it takes time to see the response to no-till. Our data would certainly support that. We've got several long-term tillage studies out there, and they all show the same type of yields. That the differences were bigger in the second 5 years than they were in the first 5 years. We can't explain it all by differences in water at planting. We explain some of it. We tend to have more water in the no-till and the reduced till. But we always see bigger yield differences in what the differences in water planting would tell us. And so that's been a consistent theme is there's something happening in season that we're not picking up. And basically, I think it comes back to we're making better use of the rain that comes in season. Because we've got more residue out there. And we get those 40, 50, hundreds type rainfall events. We're losing a smaller percentage of that to evaporation. Here's the big across years. So this has been after we kind of reconfigured the tillages. So remember the no-till in here had truly been no-till since 91, but this is looking at from 01 to this last fall. A fair bit of variability in there, obviously some complete failures. In the numbers there, those are the averages across years. Okay, so conventional till 29 bushel, reduced till 50, no-till 79. Here's the thing I want to point out. This is sorghum yields, okay, and the no-till and the reduced till, in both of those systems, the sorghum is being no-till planted into wheat stubble. The only difference between the 50 and the 79 is the tillage we're doing ahead of wheat. we're picking up a very pronounced yield penalty in the sorghum crop when we're doing tillage ahead of the wheat. And so we don't pick it up in wheat. Wheat yields are not that different, but we are seeing it in the sorghum side of things. And so, and if you look and say, well, that's just a fluke in there, that's a one-off deal. Well, is it? You can pick almost any year in there and look at the difference between the green bar and the blue bar. I don't, it's, in my eyes, it's not a one-off deal. It's been pretty consistent. And so I don't know, something to think about when you're thinking about the economics. We've got a lot of guys struggling with, can I afford to stay no-till? We've got a lot of sweeps pulled out of the fence rows and ran in the last couple of years.
Does that make a difference as to how deep that tillage was? Because one of the things we've looked at with like windmill grass is the only thing that's gonna kill it is steel.
Mhm.
Is if we hit it with like a foul master or something and just basically cut it off, you know, type of a thing, is that gonna affect that build?
So that's all this tillage all would have been sweep till. There's no disking or anything like that here. This all would have been done in sweeps.
Well, but I mean, I'm just wondering whether if you till, you know, 4 or 5 inches deep and then you plant into it, you lose some of that, because they always say on no-till over a period of time, your yields start getting better because your ground tilt is better. And then if we have to come in there and hit it with something and we're just going real shallow, does that screw that all up? Or is it basically it hasn't touched that because we're still planting below it where we got the correct tilt?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I don't have the stuff in here to show today. We've got a related study where we've looked at doing one tillage pass every 3 years or every 6 years. We're doing multiple tillage passes. In general, and this kind of goes back to the windmill grass thing, in general, we found that, you know, a tillage pass is not necessarily going to wreck us. And actually, I encourage people on the windmill grass thing to be proactive. I have a lot of producers who really don't want to till, they don't want to till, so they sit on their hands and they don't do anything about the windmill grass. And then it gets to the point where, you know, 4 years ago, they could have just made a couple passes around the outside of the field and got 95% of the windmill grass, but they didn't want to do it. They sat on their hands, and now the whole quarter is windmill grass. Now they got to till the whole thing. And so we would have been much better off to be proactive and, you know, till the outside 3-4 rounds, whatever we got to do to get the windmill grass early on, than wait. You know, so we looked at some economics on this. Oh, this is the recropping thing. This is kind of interesting. Planting sorghum into wheat stubble versus sorghum into corn stalks. So wheat sorghum fallow versus wheat corn sorghum fallow. We do get a little more, you know, not surprisingly, we've got more water in the profile at planting time going into wheat stubble than into corn stalks. That shouldn't necessarily surprise us. Okay, so here's looking at 2 crops of wheat, then sorghum fallow, wheat, sorghum, sorghum fallow, or second crop sorghum. This is again, so this is profile water at planting. We got a little bit less water when we're planting back into sorghum stalks. Here's the yield piece. This kind of comes back to that 60–70% of second year sorghum versus first year.
Is it better planting going like wheat, corn, milo versus wheat, milo, corn?
You know, so we've not seen, oh shoot, I don't have that in there. We've not seen a real strong difference between a wheat corn sorghum fallow or a wheat sorghum corn fallow. You're still gonna, whichever crop is following the wheat is still gonna have, in our experience, still gonna have the highest yield. Yeah. And my argument has always been, if I was to do, you know, my preference would be wheat, corn, sorghum fallow, because corn is slightly more responsive to water than sorghum is. And I've got the most amount of water coming out of wheat. And so I'm gonna do the best job converting it into bushels to corn. For that reason, I would go wheat, corn, sorghum fallow. So anyways, we did some economics on this. We did this as part of our Cover Your Acres deal. That video is going to be posted if you've got an interest in that. Kyle can help get registered for that and we'll get the video out to you. But we did basically try answering the question of how much can I afford to spend on fallow and stay in no-till? and we looked at some different, okay, wheat price versus sorghum price. It's really driven by the sorghum yield, because wheat does not respond that strongly to no-till. So it's really driven by the sorghum piece of it. Go from $2 wheat to $5.50 wheat, it only changed what we could afford to spend on fallow by $17. But if you go from $2 sorghum to $5.50 sorghum, it changes what we can afford to spend on fallow by $103. Because that's how much more responsive sorghum is to no-till. So those are some of the things we looked at. We can get you the video if you're more curious about that. So anyways, questions, comments? I've used more than my time, Kyle. Sorry, deduct it from my bill. Anything we didn't cover that would have been useful to you? It's kind of a hodgepodge.
Well, this is one question, maybe I answered or asked it earlier, is this year where we had tremendous, this last fall, we had tremendous yield. We've got a lot of sorghum, or I've got a lot of sorghum out there that's still got a lot of leaf. And typically, of course, our yields haven't been that high or way up there. And typically by now, all we've got left is the stalk out. So when you go in to make that first spraying in the spring, you used to be able to hit the ground with chemical. Now, what are we gonna do with all this stuff, this residue? We're not used to that much. We haven't played with that much residue. Irrigation might, but we haven't on dry land.
So I think a good practice, and I don't want to get
Control
into.
weeds if we're, how are we gonna get the chemical to the ground if we got a canopy?
So I think the best first thing the one thing, I'll make one comment and then Sarah can follow up. And I understand this logistically, this is not always easy to do. But, anytime we can plant and then spray, and especially if we've got a lot of loose residue on the surface, if we can get a planter through there, get some of that stuff knocked down, open things up a little bit. Anytime we can plant first and then spray, we're going to have a much better barrier out there of our residual products. And so I think the scenario you described certainly leads to that. And that also goes back to 30s versus something narrow versus running a drill or an air seeder through it. If we're going out there with something on 10s, we're going to get a lot more of that residue down and open things up a little bit. So I think there could be some benefit to that. Sarah, your thoughts?
Yeah, so two things about this, how does residue affect herbicide efficacy question? From a herbicide application perspective, doing things like increasing your pressure, gallons per acre, bigger droplets, right? That's gonna help that herbicide penetrate that residue and get to the ground. The other thing I would say is that the little bit of data that we do have in this regard comes out of cover crop systems backward ratings. And they're showing that over the course of the season, there was no difference in weed control when they applied their residual. They were using sulfentrazone, the experiment that I have in mind. There was no difference in weed control when they put the sulfentrazone in with their burn down for their cover versus when they put their sulfentrazone in after they, I think they had no cover, was the comparison. But the takeaway there is that the residue didn't affect the sulfentrazone. Caveat to that is it rains in Missouri a lot more than it does here in the spring. And so,
rain, I think the help difference.
yeah, so we don't have a lot of information about how those herbicides interact with the residue versus the soil, because that it's going to come out, right? If it's not broken down, that herbicide is still going to come out of that residue when it rains. Now, so I would say the best thing to do would be to manipulate planting strategies like we were talking about, and then make sure that you're increasing spray volume and droplet size, trying to get good penetration of that residue. Yeah, good questions.
So you're buying, I'm buying.
Anything else, or anything even doesn't have to be sorghum related, or something else we can help with? Hey, what's that?
Can't you help me with my?
Maybe. Hey, one thing I will throw out